What's going on, everyone? Today we will be discussing how to find quality sources. And so I think this is a talk not only good for those that are in college and have to look up all these sources for different assignments, but I think in the year 2020, this is a valuable discussion that we can all have about how we get our information, how we find our sources, and how we answer certain questions by using the internet. And so this is going to be a lot more than just, Wikipedia isn't a reliable source. We're actually going to talk about how we get this information and what is the best way to vet through all these sources in order to find quality info. Let's start with the fact that in the year 2020, the access to information is easier than ever. With Google searches being able to pull up millions of results in less than a second, it's way easier to find information than it was 100 years ago. And so this comes with both pros and cons. So even though it takes less time for us to find sources, the problem is that people don't vet those sources. 55% of internet goers have been said to spend less than 15 seconds on a page. So a lot of our news and the information and the facts that we get are just based off headlines or quick glances from these sources. And we need to do a better job in the general population of vetting and actually figuring out how to interpret all this information. So this brings up a very important question. What's a fact? And, this seems like a redundant sort of thing, but in the year 2020, now more than ever, that line between truth and fiction is very blurred. And so, you have, these different things, these different interpretations of how the world actually works. And so a lot of times that subjective feeling, how people feel about the world, that is their truth, right? But there is a lot of evidence sometimes that opposes that. And so I think it's very important whenever some sort of claim, whenever some sort of argument is made, that you look into both sides or you look into the multiple viewpoints that are being addressed, because that is a thorough way of actually addressing the arguments and the questions that people have. There are a lot of fallacies that happen when people are trying to develop their worldview, and one is called appeal to authority, which is just the fact that someone, an organization, a body, some sort of authority says something, that it's automatically true. And this isn't necessarily the case, right? So, just because someone has a business or has a magazine, has a website, doesn't mean that it's on the internet and that it's true, right? So a lot of times, just because you see something on a website, on a blog, on a podcast, doesn't matter how many views it has, doesn't matter how many likes it has, doesn't necessarily mean that it's true. And then also a problem that individuals have when developing their own thoughts, opinions, when they try to figure things out, is confirmation bias. And we all have biases. And, you can't ignore that in many aspects of life. But we have to try our best when figuring out information, when trying to answer a question, to really take into consideration that, it's the facts that should matter. It should be the data that matters, the statistics that matter. And so, a lot of times we like to hear things that support our current view. But in science, we're constantly asking questions, right? And we're constantly, trying to either prove things wrong or, try to find out more information, try to get more detailed with things. So that requires a lot of work and a lot of effort in order to do that. A lot of us get information from popular sources, right? And so we look at things like the news or, certain news websites for sources of information. And we expect that these journalists, that these people writing about studies are reputable and have done their due diligence before writing about it. But the problem with news sources and magazines are that you don't really know the vetting that takes place. And in today's age of journalism, it's a lot more about click-through rates, and it's a lot more about impressions. So sometimes you have to be wary just because, a headline says something. You're going to have to dig into it. You're going to have to see who they're quoting and what statistics they're pulling up to see if it's actually true. More and more people are getting their news from social media, and this can be a big problem because even, even magazines and newspapers and news sources do have some sort of chain of command. They do have editors. They do have people that are supposed to double check work. But social media, anyone can post anything. And so, you get someone posting information from a fringe website, it doesn't go through a vetting process. And someone who then reads the headline and assumes that to be true, now they just believed something just based off what they saw. And that can be very dangerous, especially when it comes to something like health and fitness, which you guys are in. And so you guys have to work through all these sources of information, these popular sources, to confirm what's true and what's not. And so you're going to need more reliable, more legitimate sources of information, more reliable sources of data in order to really develop answers to these questions. I don't want to be too hard on popular sources. There's also plenty of reliable websites, reliable news sources that do have a stringent editing process and a stringent research process, and it could be true. But again, I think when we as individuals are looking for answers to questions, or we're trying to develop an opinion on something, it's important to look at as many sources as possible and to get a real understanding of a situation by looking at as much as we can, all the information that we can, and then developing an opinion on it. A lot of people like to talk about statistics because, of course, it helps support an argument. When you have actual data, it actually shows you the trend in what is going on in a certain, set of parameters in an experiment, right? But I wouldn't be trusting anyone that says, look at the statistics, look at the data, look at what the studies say. And they don't actually provide their own information, right? So they're just throwing it out there and then putting the work on everyone else to go look for themselves. And they're not actually presenting any concrete evidence at all. But it's very important to note, where do we get these statistics from and how are they developed? And that's why we have to rely more and more on scholarly sources, on different experiments, studies, things like that, in order to develop our worldviews. Researchers and those in the academic community are going to publish scholarly sources such as textbooks and journal articles in order to present their current findings within a certain field. Textbooks are going to be more generalized information. They'll cover certain topics, and so if you have an anatomy textbook, a physiology textbook, they're going to go through the whole scope of current information within a field. Now, that doesn't mean that that textbook can't be outdated with some information in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, but it's just the current evidence that is presented in that field. Journal articles are going to present researchers' experiments, and so they are going to carry out a experiment in certain conditions. And so you start by using the scientific method that we have, right? And you've heard this all throughout grade school, but you have to come up with a hypothesis, a research question. And you have to research it to first make sure that that question already hasn't been answered. And there is a real need for this question to be answered. And then once you develop that question, you have to think about, as a researcher, as a scientist, what is the best way to answer those questions, and what conditions or methods are you going to use in order to figure out that answer? And so researchers will set up experiments and define their methodology and then carry out the experiment. And then once they collect that data, they have to then interpret the results based on statistics. And so a lot of times researchers are going to use correlation, right? And so they're going to see in these certain set of conditions, what is the trend likely to be? And is this phenomenon, is this statistically significant? There are many different types of studies, but many studies within the health and fitness field will use both a control group and then experimental group to see if certain conditions lead to a phenomenon. Researchers have to set up a boundary to see that if there is a significant difference in between these two groups, and have to set up certain statistic parameters to make sure that this event isn't just occurring due to chance. And so you'll learn a lot more about this in statistics courses with alpha values and p-values. But researchers really have to make sure that their experiments are set up in a way to really prove that this phenomenon is occurring. Whenever you have an assignment or a project in college, scholarly sources are going to be the ones that you are going to want to use in order to form your argument. But I'm not saying that scholarly sources don't have fallbacks. For example, like I said earlier, textbooks can be outdated or just not have the total scope of information to date. And then journal articles can have their issues as well. You have to really consider the quality of journal that you are looking for. You also have to consider that these authors have biases just like everyone else, and there's a real demand to be published, and so they may interpret the results differently than others would. And it's also important to note that just because one study necessarily shows a trend doesn't mean that it's a law of nature. But these are the more reliable way, the more valid pieces of information that we can use to actually form arguments, because they present data in certain conditions that can lead us to assume the way that things work under certain conditions. So how are you going to find all this data, all these statistics, all these scholarly sources in order for you to support your argument? So let's talk about 3 different sources that you could use: Google Scholar, PubMed, and then College Library. But all of these are basically search engines, and what you're searching for are journal articles and different textbooks and different scholarly sources that you can use in order to help you out. And so college libraries, whenever you are a student for the semester, you get access to an online search database that can pull up all sorts of journal articles. And so it's very good that you get familiar with your college's library search database. This way you know how to pull up different journal articles. But we will go into a little bit more on how to use Google Scholar and PubMed to look up different health and fitness and exercise science and kinesiology journal articles. All right, so welcome to PubMed. And now this is a resource funded by the federal government that uses Medline, which is a search database that focuses on life sciences and medicine. PubMed is also able to pull up journal articles from other life sciences journals and online books in order to provide a database for information. And so this is a reliable way to actually look up different sources and try to find out information. So let's say I have a question and I want to find more out about intermittent fasting, right? Which is a popular health and fitness topic. So let's say I want to find out more. So I could type that into PubMed. And then what would happen is I have thousands of different articles that talk about intermittent fasting. And so now you're going to get a lot of different parameters here, and just keep in mind that all we searched for was intermittent fasting. So if you want to be more specific, and that is something you're going to need to find out how to do as a scholar, right? You're going to need to learn how to really ask the right questions. You may want to go to the Advanced tab and then type in all the different things that you want to find out about. So let's be a little bit more specific with our question. Let's say, what effects does intermittent fasting have on blood glucose? So I'm going to type in intermittent fasting. We'll add that, and then we'll type in blood glucose and add that. Then we're going to search for it. And then again, now as you see, we got a little bit less of the results there. And so number 1, clinical management of intermittent fasting in patients with diabetes. And so this seems like something that would be very valuable, very interesting for us to then look up, to look at the article, and then find out more about. Now, a lot of times when you actually click on these links, you have the option of actually checking out the journal article, and you could click on those links, and then it will pull you up to the actual study. And the studies are basically broken down with an introductory section, typically a methodology section that shows what methods they use in order to find out more information, the results, and then the interpretation of those results. So it's important to not only, just read the abstract, but to go through the whole journal article to find out what did they do and then what happened. Sometimes when you click on one of these studies, it may not actually provide the full journal article, or may request that you pay for the journal article. And now a lot of times these journal articles are very expensive, but you as college students may not need to worry about that because your libraries provided by your university have access to these materials. So again, it's very important that you get familiar with the library's website and database for journal articles, because it could help you, have access to more information and more studies and more experiments. Google Scholar is another database that can be used in order to find journal articles. So if we were looking at that same exact topic that we have, we could do intermittent fasting and then also, again, add those conditions. So for Google search, you want to, make sure that you type in and I think we said blood glucose. So there we go. And then now we can have all these results pulled up that also address this same topic. It's very important whenever you're conducting research that you're as thorough as possible. And so you want to make sure that your search terms are specific and really address what you're looking for. For example, if we're talking about intermittent fasting and blood glucose, you may be looking for those with diabetes. So you'd want to include that in the search terms. Some experiments will conduct on mice or different animals, and some will conduct on humans. So you may want to include that in the search terms. You also want to make sure that maybe you pick reliable data or up-to-date data. So you may want to use this and other search engines, PubMed, your library search engines, will allow you to set the actual date and some of the parameters for your searches. And I would again just get familiar with these things whenever you're trying to research. This way, as you're doing different assignments, different projects, things like that, you become more and more familiar with those search engines. I do want to note that journal articles and textbooks aren't the only reliable sources out there. There are a lot of certifying bodies within fields that provide great information. We'll actually be making a video on that in a little bit, discussing the different certifying bodies in the exercise science and kinesiology field. But a lot of times these websites will have up-to-date information and up-to-date resources in the form of textbooks and different certifications in order to provide health professionals with the most up-to-date research. And then in addition, we also have government websites. We have different government organizations that do provide up-to-date research on certain health topics. We have to keep a few things in mind when checking our sources. So number one we'll talk about is correlation versus causation. And I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but a lot of people like to use this as an argument against scientific research. And I'm going to present it in a way that opposes that. So I will acknowledge that even though correlation doesn't necessarily mean that these conditions happen all the time or in certain groups of people, or doesn't, necessarily mean that it would be the cause of a certain condition, it does point to reliable statistical trends that are occurring and should not just be shunned just because it doesn't necessarily translate to this is how it goes every single time. These statistical correlations are what we use in order to understand certain conditions in nature. We do have to keep into account the parameters of the study. So again, what subjects are we looking at? What were the conditions that used? Are there any other things that could have impacted the results? Is there any possibility of errors, whether it be human or instrumental? And so we have to keep all these things in mind when looking at data. I mentioned earlier that authors have their own biases, and everyone has their own biases. And so it's really important just to know whenever you read a study that do the methods and do the results necessarily match what the author is trying to prove. And so a lot of experts within a field do debate scientific research, and there are a lot of comments to editors and that get published that oppose the author's interpretations of certain findings, but this is all part of scientific research. This is what it's all about, that we are trying to constantly figure out the truth and ask questions and find the best way to set up experiments in order to answer the questions. We also have to, again, consider the quality of the source. So there are hundreds of journal articles out there. And as a researcher and someone who has published things before, trust me, I get a lot of emails from different journals that are basically asking for research and will publish just about anything. So you have to really be careful when you are looking up a journal article. And we do have a tool, however, to assess this, and it's called an impact factor. So it's a graded scale just based on how reliable is an academic resource. We also have to keep in mind that sometimes all the information isn't there, and that just because we have a question doesn't mean that it's necessarily been answered. And there's a lot of gray area when it comes to things. So, just because we want it to be black and white doesn't mean that's what it is. Sometimes things happen in certain conditions, but they don't happen in others. So we really have to have an open mind when it comes to developing our worldview. I think this conversation is really important when it comes to the way we view the world, because information, again, is so readily available, and we do not take the time to vet this information. And there are just a lot of falsehoods out there and a lot of things that people believe that could easily be debunked. And that's why, as individuals, it's up to us to be accountable on the information that we take in and the information that we spread. And you as health professionals really need to make sure that before you start shouting out things as facts, that you have really done your research. And so I hope in the future that during assignments and projects and for different classes, that you really take time to research these things and then really are able to vet, okay, well, this is how, one person views it. Is there any evidence that debunks this or refutes this? And then just going back and forth between the information that is out there to actually determine where the truth lies. Thank you guys so much. I hope you guys learned a lot from this video, and be on the lookout for the next video where we'll talk about the different organizations and the different certifying bodies within the health and fitness field. Thank you guys so much, and I'll see you next video.